will also be hosting.
Your microphone has been turned on.
We will be talking about the resolutions. We'll be answering your questions. So our two facilitators, let me begin by saying who's facilitating with us this evening. We have James McKim from New Hampshire, who is the Province 1 rep for this work to Executive Council, and you can correct me and edit me, and also Zena Link, who is on Executive Council as well from Western Mass, and I am Karen Montagna, who is from the Diocese of Massachusetts and part of the Province 1 Anti-Racism Cultural Competency Leadership Team. So welcome. So I will begin with a few words from Joan Chittister for your reflection. She says that the voice of God within us is not only the voice of God. Openness, not gentility in the social arena. It is not polite listening to people with whom we inherently disagree. It is not political or civil or nice. It is not even simple hospitality. It is the munificent abandonment of the mind to new ideas, new possibilities. Without an essential posture of openness, contemplation is not possible. God comes in every voice, behind every face, in every memory, deep in every struggle. To close off any of them is to close off the possibility of becoming new ourselves. And it ends there, so I'll say amen.
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 So welcome, everyone. James, do you want to begin?
Certainly. Thank you, Karen. Let's see. I think Lois is the only person who has joined us and is, I think you're probably seeing, hopefully you're seeing three faces, one of them being mine, and I'm not Julie Lytle, as is underneath my picture. Julie is the executive director for Province 1, and she's not able to attend this session because she is at another meeting. And so I'm going to start off by just recapping what we've been talking about over the program year, as Karen said. And hopefully you can see this, the Notes Pod, Notes 52, which has at the very top this 2015-2016 web conferences section, and underneath it for the months, for the sessions that we've had, you can see the titles for those sessions. And as I mentioned just before we started the recording, we do record these sessions. We have been recording these sessions, and we've posted them on the province1.org website for folks who have not been able to attend to actually see them or hear them. So I would recommend listening to those sessions to get some tips on resources that are being used throughout the province, because people who are participating in these calls or have participated in the calls have come from all around the province in various dioceses. So they have some experiences that they've shared through the year in these sessions, and resources also that they've shared, which we have tried to capture and place in our master resources page on the Province 1 website. We may have missed one or two that have been mentioned during the conferences, but I think we've been able to get most of them on the Province 1 anti-racism page and resource page. So I commend viewing that to you. We started off the season with the Bishops Speak Out, which was a great session which had bishops from around the province sharing what was happening in their diocese and what their thoughts were about multiculturalism and awareness, and racial reconciliation. And so it was a great way to start off our program year, and gave people in the various dioceses, I think, a chance to hear their bishops speak about the topic in a setting and in a way that they probably had never been able to hear their bishop speak before. So it's this kind of opportunity to hear people who have a passion about the topic, and as well as people who are in positions to make policy and to know about policy that we've been trying to provide by the series of web conferences, and will continue to provide going forward, starting up in September of next year. I think the biggest takeaway for me from that particular session was the breadth of what actually is happening across the province, which is not well publicized. And so I think the bishops were certainly pleased to be able to share what's been happening in their provinces, and also to ask for others to join with those efforts. So that was my takeaway. I don't know, Karen or Zena, did you want to share anything about that first session?
I think you're right about the surprise about the number of things that are happening. I think often I hear that we're not doing anything across the province or in particular diocese, and their conversation revealed that there's a lot happening. Some of it is within the context of congregations and clusters of congregations that are working together, doing book readings or other initiatives. And I guess the question for us, or the challenge, is how do we make that information, that particular information, available to people? Because I think it's important, as I work in Diocese of Massachusetts, Eastern Massachusetts, when congregations feel like this is an overwhelming topic, for them to be able to know that other congregations are working on this as well and doing things that are quite easy to do within the context of the congregation or a region with other congregations, and that there are resources available for them. So they're not alone.
Yeah, so I would.
Go ahead, Zena.
Yeah, I was going to say that I would agree about the additional work that's happening throughout the diocese and the bishop's excitement about it, and the ability for people to communicate in reference to what's going on. So just this past Sunday, on Pentecost Sunday, May 15th, from 4 to 8, there was a collaboration called A Balm in Gilead, Diverse Congregations Building Beloved Community Together. And it was a collaboration that was organized by the anti-oppression team from St. James Episcopal Church in Cambridge, as well as the Beloved Community team from St. Stephen's Memorial Episcopal Church in Lynn, and the Mission Institute. So I was one of the two facilitators at that event, which drew about 57 people on a Sunday night from 4 to 8. It was a beautiful service in which we had, several priests were there. There were 4 in total that shared. We had a service in addition to conversation. There was hospitality. There was meal. Childcare was available. There was a lot of singing. So I think that examples of things like this is being sparked out of dialogues happening. So the church is very active. The question becomes, how do we share the information of what's going on? We had a laying on of hands. We had the peace, the offertory, communion. We referenced the beloved community out of the Diocese of Atlanta because we used some of the resources that they have used. We used vision, some of the information. We also referenced the Province One website several times. So people who were leaving the event that night, we encouraged them strongly to have these conversations, not just at church, but at work, at the Thanksgiving table, that the dialogues can happen pretty much anywhere you go. You can have a conversation about ethnicity and culture and oppression and race.
So Zena, Susan is typing in the question, was there a capturing of the liturgy that was used for that event that might be used as a template?
Well, we have a service bulletin that I'd be more than welcome to share. I probably would need to ask Reverend Antonelli, Holly Antonelli, because she created the bulletin. But I don't think it's a problem. I think there's also music in here and copyrights. There is a song that was written by one of the musicians, Pat Michaels. I would need to ask him if it would be okay to publish his work. But I mean, this is what we're trying to do. We're trying to get the message out. So I don't think that would be a problem at all.
Yeah, and
I'd love to share this.
And as you're talking about that, it strikes me that I have seen liturgies for racial reconciliation, and I think we may even have one of them mentioned in our resource page on the Province One website. And I'll go back and check that, but I'm pretty sure it's there. I know that there were, I'm trying to remember what it was for. Oh, I was actually asked for by one of our rectors, Gail Avery, who's actually going to become our Outreach Commission chair for the diocese. He asked if there was a liturgy for prayers of the people for the Sunday service just before Martin Luther King Day. Mm-hmm. And I did a little search and found a couple, one actually by one of our task force members, and I promptly sent that to her and she used it. So there are liturgies for entire services out there. There are liturgies for portions of the service out there that can be used, and we'll continue to try to make sure they're available on the Resource Center.
Yes, and we utilize the prayers of the people for reconciliation at the service that we had on Sunday night.
Yeah, there is an official one, I believe, that's on the Episcopal Church site someplace. For what Gail wanted, she was looking for something a little more inclusive.
Okay.
That's why we chose the version from Jane Cutting.
Nice.
All right, so that was the Bishop Speaks Out, the first session. The second webcast that we did on October 20th was led by the infamous Byron Rushing, Reverend and House Representative from Massachusetts. And he shared a bit of history about racism in the nation and in the Episcopal Church. And I think the point I took away from that was there are some factions within the Episcopal Church in the province, most of it predominantly black, AME almost, I would say, churches, know about this history. And it informs how I'm hesitating because I almost said we/they because I'm part I grew up, my mother was AME, but I grew up really truly Episcopal. So there's a history there that informs and creates the backdrop for how some people in the church behave and set their expectations. And there's a history of racism in the Episcopal Church itself that we need to tell that story. And I think it was important to understand that only by hearing that story, only by people hearing that story, can we come up with ways to reconcile the brokenness that has occurred because of that history. So that was kind of my takeaway. Karen or Zena, do you want to share your takeaways from that session? To add?
Zena, go ahead. I'm typing. I can't spell.
Well, I mean, I guess I would start by saying that we do have a great gift in knowing the history of the church, but the history, not only the history of the church, but the systematic and institutional implications of the church and faith and society and the role that it's played in oppression and in racism. At the same time, I think we have a lot to be thankful for as an Episcopal church because historically, as a faith institution, we consistently are kind of at the forefront of change of any type of oppression, whether it's against women or people who identify as LGBT or issues of racism. The Episcopal Church seems to always be in that conversation in the beginning in trying to make change, although we've been implicit in some of the oppression, which is part of the systemic and societal kind of, I guess, the word I'm looking for, residual effects of racism.
And I'm looking at Susan's question about is there a publication. There are a number of publications. The bishops have put out pastoral letters about racism. I'm blanking right at the moment about what the titles are, but you could probably look under their pastoral letters. Also, there is Let There Be Peace Among Us, an older publication that was put out involving Ed Rodman, Cheryl Kajawa, and some others. And then there is Shattuck's book called Race in the Episcopal Church, I believe. And then there is the one, there are several older materials that are probably not addressing race exactly, but they're about blacks in the Episcopal Church. And one, so what is it, the one that's got words, the title is Words from Lift Every Voice. So there's one, that one, and I'm also thinking about a much older one. So there are materials available, books and other.
And many of those materials are located on the Province One website under resources.
Yes.
And I know that there is actually on the National Church site, and I'm looking for it right now, there is a history of blacks in the church, and it talks about how the church, as Zena said, has tried to be on the forefront of change and reconciliation based on that history. So I think that's, and I'm trying to remember if that's on the resource list on the Providence One site or not. If it's not, I'll be surprised. But I would say if it's not there, definitely go to the Episcopal Church national site and search for it. And I'll try to keep searching for it as we're talking here, so I can pop it into the notes. All right. So our interestingly enough, that discussion I think leads us in terms of talking about the systematic oppression to the next month's session that we did on November 17th, which I led on "Are you benefiting from the establishment?" and the whole topic of white privilege, which really is an example of it's the instantiation, if I could use that term, of systematic oppression. So we took a look at a video that explained what white privilege is, that can be used to stimulate a lot of discussion about establishment, about systematic injustice, about the systems and the institutions that have come up that led to or lead to oppression and keep oppression going. So I think my takeaway from that session was, and I've done this kind of a session numerous times now, is that there's so much history that no one ever hears. The term redlining comes to mind. People never heard of that term redlining unless you were in the real estate world and in the establishment. But that practice is what oppressed many cultures from obtaining property in the right part of town. And that had consequences that lead to even more and more oppression and more people not being able to rise above their circumstances. So I think that was my takeaway, is we really need to educate people as to what systematic oppression exists, how it became to being, and also think about ways that we as individuals in our daily life and work can combat that systematic oppression. So Karen, Zena, any thoughts you have to share about that session? And I'm looking at a time too and cognizant that we've been talking for half an hour. We have a half an hour more, so I am going to look at speeding this up a little bit. But
okay, so I would say yes, you're very correct. If we think about, and your presentation on point, if we think about, so it's kind of subtle, right, because it's historic and it's interwoven into our institutions. We did a training this weekend where we showed part 3 of Race, the Power of an Illusion. Part 3 deals with the house that we live in, and the series talks about social, the concept or construct socially, the construct biologically, and then the construct, as you presented, that is embedded in our systems. And people who saw that film, and I continue to get this reaction, were surprised when the idea about redlining or other citizenship, other systematic things that keep people out, they were surprised about them and the impact. But, you know, your light bulb goes on when you hear about that. Oh, yeah, that's right. So I thought that was important for that reason. I also thought that I believe, James, in your talk you had some videos with different, some young people, I think, but, you know, a lot of young people are aware in a way that older people, people of my generation, may not be, because we've lived with it and it just is part of the water that we swim in.
Yeah, I would agree with what you're saying, Karen. In particular, the fact that a majority of the young people, I would say almost all of them, have grown up in a time of social media. So the messaging and their ability to access information is far different from a generation in which we grew up and even our parents grew up, and in which a lot of these systems were actually put in place. But I think the importance of talking about the systems is to acknowledge the deliberate nature in which they operated and the intent in which it was operated in, and the fact that most of this was done by the government. So what they were doing was actually legal practices to oppress a group of people based on ethnicity. And it's going to take years and years to undo. And it may, in some cases, never truly be undone because it is part of the history of why racism, that glue that kind of has racism still out there. If you think about the amount of years that people of color have even been able to attend college, right, opposed to other ethnicities. Just information like that kind of speaks to some of the challenges that some young people of color today face in regards to education. It was something that wasn't accessible to them. You could say the same thing about its history in relationship to owning property and housing and which neighborhoods have values and which don't. But I think the greatest, and in many cases, the saddest kind of residual effects of practices like this has been, and I think this could easily be changed, but the government will have to change this, is that the tax dollars that go into schools are directly related to the income tax that are paid in neighborhoods based on houses. And the houses, so that's why you have these urban schools and people with resources who find themselves in these neighborhoods or close to them just send their children to private schools rather than trying to improve, and or the creation of charter schools rather than putting money and resources and time into educating the minds of so many young people of color, whether they're immigrant, refugees. It's really kind of a systematic thing that's actually still in place, which keeps racism and poverty still going, and classism, I should say.
So Susan's asking what was a video that they saw. So, James, there were several videos so one of them was the conversation, why, do you remember the videos that you showed at the...
Yeah, what I'll do in the interest of time is point you to, there is a description of a script that I use to hold our EPOPs, our Episcopal Power of Privilege dinners. And I list a number of videos that I actually use, and the videos that I showed at that session are listed in that script. So I'll just point to that, and you'll get the videos that way. Okay. So in interest of time, let's move on.
Okay.
In December, we had the honor to have Bishop Gale, Bishop Carol Gallagher, and Heidi Kim, and our friend Deacon Emma Rosar-Northam to talk a bit about coming around to race.
Coming together around race.
Together around race. Let's see, what do I want to say on that one? I'm trying to remember the best takeaway from that one. I think on that one, I was struck by how the speakers had all experienced some of the same experiences, but from different, what's the best way to say it, perspectives,
Yeah.
Culturally.
Yeah.
And so having a a couple of bishops speak and having the missioner for
Latino, Hispanic.
Latino and Hispanic from the Diocese of Massachusetts, and Heidi being the missioner for, well, the title has changed now, but back then she was the missioner for, I believe it wasn't quite racial reconciliation. It was something else back then. But having those different perspectives, both at the diocesan level as well as from the church level, was just really interesting to hear as well. And we followed that up with a January session on the role of feelings in racial justice work, being facilitated by Reverend Dr. Bill Condrath, who just really, I think, for me at least, described really well how emotions and feelings come into play with this work that we're doing, and how we really do need to be sensitive to how people feel even when we just start to talk about this issue of multicultural awareness and racial justice work. And this one I do want to stop and ask Karen and Zeno what your takeaways were from this one, because I think dealing with feelings is so critical to how we can move forward.
So I think it's just as simple as what sometimes they call this feelings as messengers, and I think it's just as simple as knowing that your feelings are messengers, and sometimes we try to ignore, push down, get rid of whatever feelings we have, but it's important to notice those feelings because they tell us something about how we are encountering the work. And we know that some of our feelings are unconscious. We may be surprised by them, and we want to just shut them out. But I think that what I learned is that it's important actually to examine them because they tell us something about what we're experiencing in the moment and how we may move forward.
Good. Good.
Yeah, that was well said. I'm not sure I can add anything else to that, other than sometimes we're not sure what it is we're feeling, right? And sometimes we get so confused into what we are feeling. So as Karen said, we need to kind of examine more of where those feelings come from. And I think this whole sense, because the history is so far removed from the way it used to be as far as some of the outward physical brutality that was associated with racism, people often feel shame and blame associated. Nobody wants to be associated with that dehumanizing and demoralizing way in which racism played out so many years ago. So I think people need to come to terms with not being able to give away their privilege, right? There's feelings around that, being given privileges, as well as not being comfortable enough to have conversations with people they feel may not be open to how they're feeling, regardless of their ethnicity.
Good. Good. Well said. I'm just really cognizant of time, and I think I'd like to to very briefly touch on the next few sessions and really call out the forum we had on politics, race, and multicultural sensitivities, and just use that as a precursor for what we're looking at for the upcoming year. We were kind of talking before we started the recording about faith and politics, and racial reconciliation is the theme that we want to discuss in the first 2 or 3 sessions of the upcoming year, particularly with the elections happening. We last year held a few other events, which I think are, I know, are listed up on the screen, so I don't want to go into a lot of detail about them, but just call your attention to them. The two facilitator trainings that we did in November and in April, where we worked with folks who had experience with facilitating events around racial reconciliation and gave them an opportunity to practice using some of the resources that are available and some of the gifts and sharing their experiences with dealing with racial reconciliation. We will be holding another session for another workshop for facilitators in November, and I don't remember that we have the date
It's
fleshed
the week
out yet.
before Thanksgiving.
The week before Thanksgiving, yes.
The weekend before Thanksgiving. It is the 18th and 19th.
All right, so it is that's 2-day or day and a half event. We did curate resources. We have looked at book clubs, and as I think we said earlier, we know that book clubs are happening and readings about racial reconciliation are happening all over the province. We just don't know when they are, or which books they're reading, or other events like that. So we definitely want to commend those kinds of events, book clubs, and gatherings as ways to contribute to raising awareness about multicultural backgrounds and being in the world. I know there was a thought when we put this book club item on the list, Sermons, Jesus, and the Disinherited, but I don't remember exactly why we put that down there. So Karen or Zena, do you remember what that one was about?
I think somebody was reading it. One of our participants was reading it and found it very valuable.
Okay.
I think the other books, the book that people are reading now is Between Me and the World. Is it Between Us and the World?
Yeah, the world.
That's one that people are reading. And at the Trinity Institute Forum, Kelly Brown Douglas talked about her new book, she did talk about her new book called Stand Your Ground, where she traces the history of that concept and how it has given permission to people, well, white people, I think, to stand their ground, to protect their territory, to protect their, whatever environment, their empire, whatever they think that might be.
Great, thank you. So we also are looking forward to, besides our webcasts coming up, some immersions, looking at visiting several sites in different parts of the province, looking at visiting the Black Heritage Trail, looking at visiting Vermont's African American Heritage Trail, the Center for Reconciliation in Providence. So looking for those experiences, providing those experiences or opportunities to have those experiences to help people understand our history and have a common language with which to speak as we go forward.
So Susan's saying that she'd be very interested in an immersion opportunity, so we'll make sure that those get publicized. But also, Susan, I would be interested in hearing about places and sites in your own, in Vermont. So what we're talking about is historic places. The Reconciliation Center in Rhode Island. There is the Royal House here in Medford, Massachusetts, where they still have the enslaved people's homes and things like that. We're trying to compile places where, we might do a pilgrimage, as so many of the other, like Atlanta, I think, for one, have done pilgrimages going to these various sites.
Right. Great. So we wanted to next talk about the General Convention resolutions that are applicable to the work that we're doing around multicultural awareness and racial reconciliation. And we've listed those convention resolutions here in the notes box, starting with A24, which is directing the diocese to examine the impact of the doctrine of discovery, and that, of course, being around coming to the Americas and basically pushing the Native Americans aside, looking at the impact of that and how we reconcile that action and that was taken over time. A182, using education, community dialogue, and internal audits to respond to all forms of racial injustice, is really around affirming the spirit of being inclusive in accordance with our baptismal covenant. And seeing how we can use conversation to move forward with racial reconciliation. And also looking at, from an internal to the church perspective, and not starting to, but continuing to investigate through an internal audit what concrete steps the wider church should take to address systematic racial injustice inside the church. Looking at A183, right after that, recommending the book study for the triennium. So my understanding of the history is every triennium there is a book that's identified that should be read by everyone, or as many people as possible in the church. And so for this triennium, the book, The New Jim Crow, Mass Incarceration in the Age of Colorblindness by Michelle Alexander, was chosen as the book that we would want folks to read. So we're looking to recommend to all the book clubs that are in various parishes across the province that they include this book in their list of books that they cover for their book clubs. Now, I struggle with this a little bit because I'm from New Hampshire, and my friends in Vermont and Maine have the same kind of challenge, or feel the same kind of challenge, in that we're maybe 2%, if that, African American. And this book deals with African Americans and black racial issues. So is this a book that I should be recommending above other books to the Diocese of New Hampshire? I struggle with that. I will say where I've come down is I will recommend that it be read because it opens up eyes of people who may be not from New Hampshire to what they probably have experienced in the past or has happened in a place where they may have lived in the past. We are a state of people who were not necessarily born and raised in the state. And we are a state of people who have a presence in the real world outside of our state. So I do think it's important for us to recommend that the book be read for that purpose, not necessarily that we have the problem here in New Hampshire that it happens in other places, but the problem does exist, and we as people in the United States and in the world need to know that it does exist, and we can do things to improve our nation, which will in turn improve us in life in New Hampshire.
You know, what I think, James, is that I think one of the values of the book is that it reveals that same kind of history and systematic and institutional. I mean, this has become a national cash cow, and it also shapes the image that we have of men of color because we always see them in jail, and they're always on TV in jail. But also, I know that well, I don't know because I don't live in those states, but, Native American issues that may be more salient to the conversation there. So I would put them together on a shelf. Those are
Right. Right. So that's A183, and then the last resolution that we look at, and we bring up these resolutions because in addition to faith and politics for next season, we are looking to discuss 2 or 3 of these general resolutions and what we can be doing in the province to live into those resolutions. So the last resolution is the established response to systematic racial injustice. And this is the resolution we were speaking about earlier where there has been $1.2 billion allocated in the budget for this triennium to implement various programs to improve racial reconciliation work. So again, looking at the question about Black Lives Matter movement, that's an area that the Executive Council and various task forces, the one I'm on, for example, are going to be looking at which national trends, which national programs do we want to get behind, and how do we do that? How do we make that happen in a way that's going to work across the church, not just in specific areas? So, and my role as the Province 1 representative will be to bring back to this province and to these webcasts, one of the ways that I'll be communicating exactly what the National Church Committees have decided and help to drive how we as a province can make some of those things happen. Okay.
Great, thank you.
So I see we have 5 minutes left. And you can see the topics that we have at the bottom of Notes 52 box here that we're thinking we'd like to talk about. We're open at this point to feedback as to, are there other topics that we might add? Are there particular resolutions of those that we've discussed that you'd want to have a session on or more discussion on in one of these webcasts? Now's your time to share. If you have any questions about what we've talked about over the past year, now's the time. And I guess it's really Susan and Lois and I guess James behind Susan. Any questions or any thoughts about the past year or the upcoming year? Go ahead, Susan.
So I've been, following a lot of the politics around access to bathrooms with the laws down in North Carolina and other states, and everything is so interwoven, the system of oppression for, gender identity, race, Muslims, just it's all intertangled and intertwined. And I'm just wondering how we can really, bring this kind of awareness of this intertwined oppression without diluting specific facets of it, because, people say, well, all lives matter, but then, well, no, there's a Black Lives Matter movement, or, the rights of, diversity and gender identity. And so I'm just wondering how we can, sort of untangle it, sort of.
Yeah, I would say that's a very good point, and the way I've been looking at this is that we are following the Jesus movement. And to me, the Jesus movement is how we address all of these issues. The tricky part is that there are places where the Jesus movement is needed more than other places. So we have to figure out where those places are and how to apply the Jesus movement to those places. And I think that's where the Black Lives Matter campaign, for example, comes in. There are places where that's strong. And in those places, we should be applying the Jesus movement. There are other places where the Black Lives Matter effort is not as strong, but you may have, like that's happening in North Carolina now in the legislature, that oppression that is coming from the legislators who just, they don't get it. So we need to bring the Jesus movement to that effort in that locale. So I think it's important for us as a province to come together and really identify through the people who are willing to be involved what's the big issue where they live. And that's where we apply the Jesus movement. That's my take on it, at least. Karen or Zena, you have any thoughts on that?
I think you're right about that. That's one of my big learnings from all of this work, is that there's no cookie cutter. Remember when we first wrote the grant, we were supposed to come up with one curriculum that would be used. We, maybe incorporate all of them, mix them all together or something. But what I've come to is, and particularly working with congregations, is that it has to be contextual. It has to meet the people where they are, what's alive for them. And so I think you're right about that.
Yeah, I agree, and I think that is why the suggestions for how to use those resources are very important. It also speaks to what you were saying, James, before about your uncertainty about recommending certain texts. Everything is regional, right, and it's in its own context. So there's some resources that you may only introduce a chapter or two to a group of people. And then if they're hungry for more, they'll end up reading the entire book, but maybe just introduce a chapter, right? So I think that there are different, I'm just echoing what has already been said, but there is certainty that it's going to present differently. It's like raising children. They have different needs, right? You have to treat them differently based on what their needs are at the time. And I think that as children of God, it's a similar analogy. Our needs are going to be different. We're all children of God, but our needs are different at different times, and we all need to be fed by the Spirit.
Good. So we are at 8:30. I think this has been a good discussion. I probably talked more than anybody. So I hope I tried to give people an opportunity to speak and to be interactive here. So hopefully this has been good for you, Susan, and for you, James, listening back in the background there, and Lois, who's been quiet. Certainly for me, talking through this, as I think Karen said, going through this process has been a real learning experience. And no one has a silver bullet. No one has all the answers. But I would say we all have the answers. The answers are here. We just need to keep talking through how to apply those answers in our specific situations. So with that, I think I will close, or I'll ask Karen if she wouldn't mind closing us out with a closing prayer.
Sure. So as we think about all these topics, it can be overwhelming, and there's so much information to process. So I will close with this poem by David White. It's called Enough. Enough. These few words are enough. If not these words, this breath. If not this breath, this sitting here, this opening to the life we have refused again and again, until now, enough. Amen.
Amen.
Good night,
Amen.
everyone.
Great. Well, thank you all, and we'll see you in September.
Okay, blessings.
Um,
Cool.